Hello, welcome to Heavy D Storytelling, where I'm going to tell you a story. Um, yeah, I don't know if you heard that or not. Hello, welcome to Heavy D Storytelling, where I'm going to tell you a story. Today we've got the Bible, we've got the Bronze Bow, Chapter 2, and it's going to be a good time and a good story, and you're going to enjoy it, or else. So, I don't see anybody there yet. Here, I'll go ahead and share a link so that people know that we exist. Oh, one person's on. Thank you so much for joining us. And all right, I'm going to go ahead and we are not quite ready. It didn't feel like you were quite ready. However, so, I don't know what to say. Drink some coffee because I've been up since 5:15 and I've got schoolwork after this. Hi, Daddy. Hi, Kimmy. It's nice to see you here. Getting PJs and teeth brushed. That's good. Those are good things. So I'm being patient. Do 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 do. So I will just brag on myself just a little bit because I don't do that very often. But I got a tell a joke. We haven't brushed our teeth. Okay, so I got a 92% on my final exam for, and I thought it was like a second exam, but it was actually a final because it had some of the stuff from the first half of the class. Anyway, it gave me 980 points out of a possible 1010, which is an A. So I get to keep my 4 point for one more class. So that's good. All right. So let's see, a joke. I don't know very many jokes. Let's see. I think Daniel was the joke person. Um, let's see. So once there was um, a, a rope that went into a bar, and the bartender said, "We don't serve your kind here. Go, go out." He was upset. Went out. The next day, he was all frazzled. Comes back into the bar. Bartender says, "Aren't you that rope I told you not to come in here?" He said, "Nope, I'm afraid not." Okay. See, it's not really that funny. So that's the problem with me telling jokes. So Daniel does a really good job telling jokes. We didn't get to talk to Daniel today, did we? And it's Wednesday, isn't it? Oops. Uh, Booger snot in a knot. So, boop, 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 boop. Alrighty. Let's see, another joke. Oh, yeah, not the joke person. That's right. I'm not the joke person. Um, Kimberly, I don't think she understood it. I think that's what all that emoji stuff means. We did. I probably asked something and you said we did, and I don't even remember what I asked because I am a little bit scatterbrained right now. Oh, you talked to Daniel, called 1 minute into your movie, which is exactly the way it should go. Um, I So the story is that when Rebecca and Ben were little, we would watch about maybe 30 seconds of a show, and um, and then we would get interrupted with one or the other of them, and then we'd go another 27 seconds into the show and we'd get interrupted with the other one, and we wound up at, I remember watching a lot of Star Trek, because Rob Pryor had all the Star Trek episodes, and he let us borrow them. And so I remember watching a lot of Star Trek with subtitles because couldn't we couldn't play it loud enough, or I don't know. I don't know what was going on. Like maybe I don't know why it was so loud. Or maybe we just couldn't play it loud enough because it was distracting them and not letting them go to sleep or something. I don't know. Anyway, I remember watching that very slowly and with subtitles. All right. So it is now 9:23. Well, 8:23 in the Central Time Zone. So I don't see our Orlando representative here. That was how it happened. Okay, that was how it happened. That's good. So there's a new, maybe I'm the only one that has this ability, but I can pin something. I can pin a comment. Maybe that brings it to the top so that, like, if there's a comment that's really important that I want to have showcased, then maybe that's how I can do. All accounted for. All right, let's get started. All right, so we are in the book of Mark. We're going to read, just got a notification on my phone. We're going to read chapter 5 because we read chapter 4 yesterday. This is the English Standard Version of the Bible. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs, a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him any more, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you done with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting in the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him, and he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. Hi, Becca. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even the garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, and be healed of your disease." While he was speaking, there came from the ruler's house someone who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement, and he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. That's the end of chapter 5. Tomorrow we'll read chapter 6. Um, I did mention that Mark is apparently Peter's gospel. So Mark traveled around with Peter and kind of basically collected his sermons, or had a large opportunity to hang out with Peter, um, and learned a lot about Jesus from that experience. So when we read Mark's gospel, we're reading Peter's account of Jesus. And so it's really important. A lot of things that happen are things that happen to Peter specifically in that gospel. So we can look for that as we read it. But in that particular last story, it was Peter, James, and John that went with Jesus into Jairus's home and saw the girl being raised to life from the dead. Okay, so here we are. We're on chapter 2. I'm sorry I don't have a summary because I don't do that. I've tried, but I don't tell the story very well. I don't tell the story as well as they do. Basically, there's this girl and there's this boy, and they came up on the mountain. And there's another boy named Daniel Baryaman who lives on the mountain. He kind of ran away. His grandmother and his sister, who is kind of reclusive. In other words, she hasn't gone out of her house probably in the last 10 years. That's pretty reclusive. Just think about Corona times like ridiculous. So anyway, but she's doing it voluntarily because she just doesn't like to be around the world. And Daniel actually ran away from the blacksmith who was kind of abusive, I guess, to his. I wanted to say the word accomplice, but that's not the right word. To his understudies, the apprentice. I'm sorry. This is why I don't do the synopsis. Anyway, so long story long, basically, they're going back down and they're trying to. I think Daniel's trying to talk Joel, who is the boy, into, and the girl is Malface, I think it's her name. And he's trying to talk the boy into going up and living with him and Rosh, who is probably the Messiah. We don't know yet because we haven't read the whole story, but I mean, if I'd never read the Bible, that's who I'm putting my bet on. All right, so chapter 2. As I said, there's no chapter titles, just numbers. Chapter 2. Wait here, Daniel said to Joel. He strode down the path past Malface. Go up and wait with your brother, he ordered, scarcely giving her a glance. Where have you been all day? Ebol greeted him. Rosh needs you. Rosh? Where? The man jerked his head toward the rocky hillside. 7 of us. There's a job to do. Even to Daniel's practiced eye, there was not a sign of life on the barren slope. Right now? Now. I am. I just got the text message that says ready. That was 9 minutes ago. Perfect. Sorry. Right now? Now. There's a pack train coming from Damascus with a string of slaves. They've almost reached the pass. Easy. No guard to speak of. All we're to take is 1 slave. No money? Not a thing but the slave. A black fellow, big as an ox. Rosh spotted him yesterday when they stopped at Merom. Too good to waste on the galleys, Rosh says. Who are those 2 up there? A boy I used to know in the village and his sister. What are they doing on the mountain? They climbed up here for a holiday. The man snorted. Get rid of them. There's no time to waste. Daniel climbed back to where the 2 stood waiting. I can't go on with you, he said, ignoring the curiosity in both their faces. You'll be safe from here on if you hurry. Joel didn't move. Is that one of Rosh's men? He demanded. Daniel did not answer. I know it is, said Joel, and there's something going on. His eager look scanned the hillside. Rosh is somewhere near here, I'm sure of it, and I want to see him. Please, Daniel. I may never have another chance. With the certainty that Rosh's eyes were on them even at this moment, Daniel dared not delay. No, he almost shouted. Forget Rosh and get down the road as fast as you can. He was astonished at the anger that flashed in Joel's eyes. Who are you to order me around? Do what I tell you, Daniel insisted. There's going to be trouble any minute now. Excitement flared into Joel's face. Romans? No, you fool, not Romans. The boy's jaw had a stubborn set. You don't own this mountain, and neither does Rosh. I'll go where I please. 2 pairs of eyes stared hotly at each other. What about your sister? Daniel asked, and watched the defiance blank out of the boy's face. Too bad, he thought briefly. He's the kind we need. There was a sound of running feet. A boy about 12, thin as a scarecrow, came racing up the road, face crimson, eyes bugging. Coming, he stammered. They've passed the dead oak tree. He scrambled up the steep bank of rock and vanished like a lizard into one of the jagged crevices. Distinctly now, Daniel heard the first sounds of an approaching caravan, the groaning protest of the camels, the bump of heavy loads against the rocky sides of the pass, an occasional muttered order. Too late, he warned. Get up the bank, both of you, and out of sight. What on earth? Kimmy, are you bored? Okay, sorry. Got distracted there. Joel whirled on his sister in sudden fear. Face, you heard him. Get up there, quick, as far as you can. The girl lingered maddeningly. Joel, what? Hurry, Thace, I'll explain later. Then, with a snort of despair, Joel grasped her hand, jerked her toward the bank, and gave her a push. Up there, he repeated. Lie flat and keep your head down, and don't make a sound no matter what happens. Daniel watched with approval. Once he had caught on, the boy had acted fast. The girl, too. She had gone up those rocks like a mountain goat. Then he saw that Joel had turned and was coming back. I'm staying with you, the boy said. There was no time to argue. Daniel grasped him by the arm and dragged him up the opposite bank. As they crouched behind a boulder, a bull loomed beside them. He's all right, Daniel spoke quickly. I vouch for him. One sound from him. The man made one swift gesture. He won't, said Daniel. See to it then. Now mark this. Wait for the signal. The one in the yellow and the purple is yours. No sport about it, Rosh says. No killing. He was gone, as though he had melted into the rocky bank. In the still air, Joel's breathing was loud. The boy's eyes, fixed on Daniel's face, were feverish. Daniel felt his own heart begin to pound. This was Rosh for you, he wanted to say. You could never be sure what would happen next. Days on end with no excitement, and then all of a sudden Rosh would see something he needed or wanted, and like a hawk he would pounce. Daniel began to feel the crawling in his stomach, half fear and half pleasure. Only recently had he been allowed apart. He wasn't used to it yet, especially the waiting. Joel nudged him. What do we do? He whispered. I do it, Daniel answered. You stay here. Joel's eyes sparkled. His young face was taut, his hands clenched so that the knuckles knobbed out. Daniel saw that he had no intention of staying there, and an elation he had never felt before leapt in him. Suddenly he grinned back at Joel, and in that instant they heard a sound just below them. Close together they edged their foreheads around the rock. The first of the train came in view, a burly guard armed with a heavy staff, and behind that a second guard with a sword on his side, both walking silently, glancing uneasily at the rocky banks. They knew they were approaching a bad spot on the trade route, lonely, narrow, and treacherous. Above them the boys waited, holding their breaths as the rest of the caravan wound slowly into sight. It was not much to brag about. 4 mangy camels, lurching grudgingly up the steep bank, their burdens swaying. A string of underfed mules, one litter with dingy curtains, 4 ordinary tradesmen. With disgust, Daniel marked the one in the purple and yellow headdress. The man was fat and out of breath and looked scared to death already. How long would it be before Rosh would give him a full-sized job to do? Behind the tradesmen plodded the slaves, first the men, and then a drab cluster of women, herded close together, urged on by the flicking whips of 2 more guards in the rear. No question of which one Rosh wanted. Over the whole party towered one murderous-looking slave, with lash-ridged shoulders and an ugly scar. What would Rosh want with such a brute? Daniel wondered. Still, it ought to be easy. Only 8 men to account for. He caught Joel's eye and grinned again, and then both of them jumped to the shrill whistle. Instantly, the hillside erupted. Out of the corner of his eye, even as he moved, Daniel saw Rosh, always one jump ahead, hurl himself at the first guard. Accurate as hawks, other figures dropped to their chosen targets. It was too easy. The man in the striped headdress was fumbling for his dagger when Daniel caught his arm, twisted it back, and seized the weapon from the fat, unresisting fingers, poked it against the roll of fat that covered the man's ribs. He stared down into the pudgy face, at the moist eyes blinking with terror, the cheeks gray with sweat, the fat lips trembling, and he felt cheated. There was no sport in a match like this, but he had his orders, and he held the knife steady. Around him there was a brief, efficient struggle, a few blows, some wailing shouts, the scream of a camel, all muffled in a spurt of choking dust. Then silence, and the familiar hoarse bark of Rosh giving orders. The skirmish was over. He drew back his dagger, let go of the man's arm, and stood back. Slowly the caravan pulled itself together and moved on. Grateful to escape with the loss of one slave, the tradesmen knew better than to argue. When they had straggled out of sight, Daniel took quick stock. One of Rosh's men lay on the path, his legs thrashing. Another mopped blood from his arm. No one else appeared to even be winded. Joel stood rubbing his shoulder. Is that all there is to it? He demanded. Daniel strode across the path and pulled the cloak down from Joel's shoulder, revealing a bruise already darkening and swelling. Who gave you that? He demanded. Joel reddened. I meant to get the other arm of your man, he said, but his plagued mule. Daniel choked back a roar of laughter. At any rate, we got the slave, Joel added, looking ridiculously pleased with himself. The cause of the fracas stood motionless in the middle of the path, a giant of a man, naked except for a filthy loincloth, his black skin mottled with purplish bruises and patches of mud. Daniel, with an ironsmith's eye, noted that the band's binding wrists and ankles were of double weight. The slave stood like a beast of stone, unaware that they had gone to this trouble to free him, indifferent that he had exchanged one master for another. Once again Daniel doubted Rosh's choice. There was there was power there, all right. Those huge excuse me, those huge arms could crack the ribs of a man as easily as a child could snap a twig, but the broad face with a livid scar showed no sign of intelligence, only an animal wariness that would mark the time to strike. Then Daniel saw Rosh coming toward them. Rosh had a squat, thick body with a short, muscular neck and a grizzled head which seemed to thrust forward directly from the powerful shoulders. Now, under the bristling eyebrows, his small black eyes glittered at Joel, not with surprise, because Rosh never allowed himself to be surprised, but with a hostility that made Daniel step forward and speak first. We've got a new recruit, Rosh, he said. Heavy legs braced. Rosh measured the newcomer. Speak up, boy, he barked. Who are you? Rosh was used to seeing men cringe. Joel did not cringe, and though he was speechless, the pure hero worship that shone from his eyes must have melted even Rosh's suspicion. Joel Bar Hezron, sir, he finally managed. Your father knows you're here? No, sir. In trouble in the town, are you? Oh, no. Then what do you want with me? Joel stood his ground. I wanted to see you, he said, because they say that someday you will drive the Romans out of Israel. When you do, I want to be with you. Rosh's teeth flashed from the midst of his matted black beard as his gnarled hand came down on the injured shoulder. Daniel saw the tears start into Joel's eyes, but the boy did not flinch. Well said, Rosh thundered. Any man who hates the Romans is welcome here. I did not come to stay, Joel explained unhappily. I'd like to, but I can't, not now. I just came up here for a holiday, and my sister is with me. And in a few days we're moving to Capernaum. Rosh's approval twisted to anger. Not after what you've just seen, he said, his voice ugly. Now you stay here. Daniel knew that Rosh was bluffing. Rosh had had a price on his head for too long to care now what news reached the village, but Joel could not know that, and Daniel felt a surge of pride at the steadiness of the boy's eyes. I'm taking my sister home, Joel answered. But if you mean I'd talk, you're wrong. If keeping silent is all I can do for now, then you can count on that. Ross studied the boy. You're certain you want to work for me? I'm certain. You think you know how to keep your eyes open and your mouth shut? Yes. Then go along to Capernaum. There's time enough. When your turn comes, you'll hear from me. Ross turned away. The matter settled. Suddenly, without warning, Daniel was taken by a flood of jealousy. Not a word, not a look at him. Who had captured the merchant and held him while they took the slave? What had Joel done besides getting in the way of a mule's hind leg? He wished again that he had never laid eyes on the boy. What do you think of him? Ross was shouting to his men, waving a hand at the black slave. Worth a little trouble, eh? By the look of him, one man muttered, we're all like to wake up dead some morning. That's no joke, said another. He could crack two of our heads together like a pair of walnuts. Rosh only grinned. He walked up to the slave and clapped a hand on the trunk-like forearm. His own powerful body was dwarfed beside that of his prisoner. Don't look so glum, man, he roared. Don't you know when you're in luck? The slave stared down at him, uncomprehending. Do you understand me? Rosh questioned impatiently. Do you have a name? Not a flicker livened the stony features. There was some laughter. Samson, someone suggested. Goliath. Deaf, maybe, one man guessed. Dumb too, I wager. Lots of us, lots of those black ones are mutes. Rosh shrugged. We'll see. We took him for his muscles, not his tongue. He'll prove his worth soon enough. Excuse me. If he ever learns which side he's fighting on, someone muttered. Rosh's good humor vanished. The joke had gone too far. I'll do the choosing, he roared. I don't ask for a vote by a pack of lily-livered jackals. Bring him along. He stamped scornfully up the trail without a backward look. The men eyed each other, each waiting for someone else to make a move. Then, without knowing what prompted him, Daniel stepped into the path. I'll take him, he said, reaching for the short length of chain that dangled from the iron wristband. 5 of the men tripped over each other to follow their leader. Even the man who had lain writhing on the trail got hastily to his feet. 2 reluctantly stood by, willing to reinforce Daniel from a distance. Daniel looked back at Joel. With the slave's chain in his hand, he felt he had regained his former advantage. There was nothing to say now. The affair was over. Joel's eyes met his in a brief salute, and between the 2 boys something flashed, a wordless exchange that was both a farewell and a beginning. Though the slave plodded forward without urging, Daniel was forced to check his own pace when he realized how narrow a stride the iron shackles allowed. At the first turn in the trail, he looked back. Joel still stood in the path looking after them. Then he saw Malthace coming down the rocky bank in one sure fluid course, her dark hair falling about her shoulders. He remembered with sudden clearness what he had not even been aware seeing up there on the mountain, the way that hair had sprung, clean and alive and shining like a bird's wing, back from the smooth forehead. He watched till the girl joined her brother, and then he set his face toward the mountain with his prisoner. He left the trail and struck off toward the right to follow a steep pitched course among the boulders. Once again, prompted by the sure grace of the girl, the thought of his own sister stirred in him like an old wound. Daniel already regretted the impulse that had prompted him to lead the slave. He knew well enough why he had done it. It had been nothing but a boast, an urge to make up for the fact that Joel had found favor with Rosh. He had plenty of chance now to curse his own childishness as he inched his way up the rocky course beside the chained ox. The 2 men who had stayed behind chafed at the slow pace, their crude jests about the prisoner soon changing to oaths at his lumbering progress. Once the sun dropped below the horizon, the dark came on swiftly, making their way even more difficult. It was like a release from a nightmare to smell at last the fragrance of roasting meat, to hear the sound of voices, excuse me, and to emerge at the familiar clearing. A roaring fire near the mouth of the cave lit up the circle of men sprawled on the hard dirt. The meal was almost over, and Daniel's two companions lost no time in flinging themselves down for their share. No one paid the slightest attention to the slave for whom they had a few hours earlier risked their necks. Daniel stood uncertainly, the chain in his hand. Rosh waved a greasy mutton bone in his direction. See that Samson. Excuse me. Sorry, it's getting late here. See that Samson gets his big belly full, he shouted. After tonight he works for it like the rest of us. A roar of laughter applauded him, but no one moved to carry out his command. Daniel perceived that in his absence the matter had been settled. Samson they had christened the slave, and Samson he would remain, no matter what his proper name might be. And Daniel had only himself to thank that he had been promoted to Samson's keeper. He went to the chill depths of the cave where the goat-skin water bags were kept, and after he had taken a long deliberate draught for himself, he carried a gourd of water to the slave. The gourd contained only enough for two tremendous gulps, and he went back to fill it twice more. Then he brought a huge slab of mutton. The black man snatched it from his hands and sank his teeth into it with a ferocity that turned the boy's stomach. He tore off two chunks of barley bread and laid them down within the slave's reach. Then he went to the other side of the fire and sat down apart from the others. He had lost interest in his own supper. Rosh did not let him rest for long. What are you waiting for? The leader prodded him. Get your file to those chains. Tonight? Daniel was startled. Around the fire, the sprawling figures reared up in protest. Leave the shackles on him. He won't know the difference. He'll know right enough, and so will we when we get our heads smashed in. Shut your mouths, roared Rosh. What kind of patriots are you? We'll have no slaves on this mountain. He's one of us. Get that through your heads. I'll double the watch so you pigeon-hearted can sleep. But the man sleeps free. With a sigh, Daniel got to his feet. The job, this job, would have fallen to him anyway, since he was trained to the trade of blacksmith. It was not the first time he had removed manacles. Two of the men who now sat near the fire had made their escapes from the Roman mines. He went now to get the chisel and the mallet and a heavy file. The slave crouched in a sort of stupor after his meal. When Daniel signed to him to stretch out his arms, he blinked stupidly. Gradually, he seemed to comprehend what was required of him. He shifted his heavy frame and allowed Daniel to stretch the manacled wrists across the flat surface of rock. Then Daniel bent himself to the task that he knew would take half the night. Rosh stumbled to the pile of skins in the cave. Most of the men stretched out where they lay, pulling their cloaks over their heads and falling at once into slumber. The man who had first watch, planning to wake reinforcements before the slave was freed, settled down to observe Daniel's labor. From time to time he renewed the fire so that Daniel could see to work, but beyond that he had no intention of helping. Daniel's shoulders began to ache. The steady rasp of the file, which seemed to make little headway on the double thickness of metal, wore his nerves thin instead. After an interminable time, a narrow channel sank almost through the first band. The slave did not move. The guard board prowled about the fire, poking in the ashes for scraps from the meal. To keep himself awake, Daniel began to talk, expecting and getting no response. I know this is hard on you, he said, but it's no joke for me either. Rosh was right about the chains, but if he'd had to do the job himself, I wager it could have waited till morning. Still, what Rosh says goes, and you might as well learn that tonight. The black eyes in the half darkness looked like bits of polished basalt. You don't know what's happened, do you? Daniel asked. You've got Rosh to think that you're not on the way to the galleys. You don't know what the galleys are either, I suppose. But do you know the taste of a whip? That's plain. You do know, sorry, the taste of a whip. That's plain. Well, that is over. It's not easy here in the cave, but there are no chains and no whips. You're safe now. The slave gave no sign that he either heard or understood, but Daniel went on, thinking out loud, shutting out the grating of the file with the sound of his own voice. Rosh is the finest leader you could ask for. He pretends to be careless, but actually he leaves nothing to chance, not the slightest trifle. He has eyes in the back of his head. That's why he's been successful, and his band is growing, while other bands break apart or even get captured. And he is afraid of nothing on earth, nothing. He laughs at the Romans. There are more coming to join us every day. Some day there'll be enough. Rosh asks of them all just one thing. They must hate the Romans and be willing to go on fighting till the last cursed one of them is driven from the land of Israel, and Israel is free. We live only for that, and so will you. Rosh knows he's not taking much of a chance with you. Any man who has worn these things on his wrists will die before he'll have them on again. Do you know what I'm saying, Samson? I can see you don't, but soon I'll show you something you can understand. The fire had died down to a flicker, and the night was far gone when the last of the 4 iron bands had worn thin. Daniel whistled to the guard, who jumped nervously to wake 2 comrades. The 3 stood watching, swords in hand. Daniel picked up the chisel and the mallet. The bands fell with a clatter that woke half the camp. Then he stood back. The slave still knelt, looking down at his hands, not moving. Finally, Daniel bent toward him, touched his shoulder. The heavy man shifted, heaved up, and reared over Daniel. For an instant Daniel knew a shaft of real fear as the massive arms slowly reached, stretched to their appalling length, and the chest expanded in a deep breath. Then suddenly, in one incredible swift motion, the man went down on his knees, and before Daniel could move, he had seized the boy's foot in his huge hands and bent to lay his forehead against it. Daniel jerked his foot away. Get up, he snapped. It is Rosh who freed you. When the slave did not move, he turned and walked away. That's done, he said, trying to hide from the guards his quivering embarrassment. I could sleep for a week. He located his sheepskin cloak, wrapped it around him, and lay down just outside the circle of firelight. Samson came crawling toward them and hunched at his feet. Exasperated, he got up again, rummaged in the cave for another tattered cloak, came back and flung it over the naked shoulders, and lay down again. Then he pulled his own cloak over his head and slept. He was too tired even to wonder why he was not afraid. That's the end of chapter 2. We're at 45 minutes. I know we're still a little bit on the short side, but we're getting started late. So I don't think I can, yeah, chapter 3 is longer. So it's almost 15 pages. So I don't think I have time to read chapter 3 right now, and I'm actually kind of tired and have to do some more homework tonight before I go to bed. So I'm going to go ahead and call it there. And I appreciate you joining us tonight. If you have any comments, I see that you have no problem sharing those. So thank you very much for all your comments. Go ahead, when I'm reading, go ahead, make comments, just pay attention. And I'm totally good with that. Uh, just no chatter with your mouth. So this has been Heavy D Storytelling, and I'm Heavy D. I hope that you enjoyed the story tonight. And we will be back tomorrow with chapter 3 of the Bronze Bow, chapter 6 of Mark, and we will see you again tomorrow. God bless you and have a wonderful, super night. Love you guys. We'll see you tomorrow.